A federal grand jury has indicted the man accused of shooting and killing the late former Speaker of the House, Melissa Hortman, and her husband as part of a larger plot to kill lawmakers. The indictment lists murder, stalking, and firearms charges against Vance Boelter. The murder charges could carry the federal death penalty. Now, Boelter is accused of going to the lawmakers' homes on June 14th, disguised as a police officer in a fake squad car with a manifesto of potential targets. Prosecutors say along with killing the Hortmans, Boelter also seriously wounded State Senator John Hoffman and his wife, shooting them nearly 20 times combined, but they survived. Authorities say he also stopped at the homes of two other lawmakers, but they were not home.
The investigation has shown that Vance Boelter had spent months investigating his targets. He had names, he had lists of names of people that he was interested in investigating, addresses, names of their family members. He appears to have conducted surveillance at least some of the houses.
After 40 hours on the run, Boelter was captured in what authorities called the largest search for a suspect in Minnesota history.